So, good evening, everyone. And my name is Ash. I wrote the book Running Lean, and I've been practicing lean for a little while. I have a blog that I'll talk more about these in the actual presentation. How many of you are familiar with the term? How many of you I would say are familiar with Lean Startup? Have read Eric's book or my book? Okay. So I know that Alex Osterwalder was by, and so I'm going to do a little, an introduction of running lean and talk about that. I don't want to talk for very long. I like these to be very interactive. So I'm going to do probably a 20-30 minute talk on just what running lean is and what lean startup is, some of the principles, and then I just turn back for a question answer after that, so we can get into any level of detail. So I didn't get a very good gauge of just how much lean startup have you been exposed to already. So we'll start with that intro talk. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, can you guys see the screen? Okay, so I'm going to just go into full screen mode. And so I won't see you for a little while, but once the talk is over, I'll come back and you'll get to see me, and we'll just go into the question answer. So just by way of introduction, I usually like to introduce myself as an entrepreneur. And so I hate to start with the bad news, but you've probably heard this already, is that most products fail. And it's not even startups, but just products in general fail. The good news, though, is that there is a different metric. Most of the startups that even succeed report having drastically changing their plans along the way. So what they start out with, their original idea, their original vision, is not really where they end up. And what that tells us is that the separates the successful entrepreneurs from those that don't quite make it is not necessarily starting with that perfect plan A or that perfect idea, but finding a plan that works. And the key part here is before running out of resources. And that, in many ways, was the search that I kind of embarked on. I wanted to find a systematic process for going from that initial plan to one that works. And for me, before even the lean startup movement kind of was in full gear, I was practicing. I was a practicing entrepreneur, and I had run into a lot of projects which had mediocre success. And that was always a search for me. It was always trying to find better ways to build products, better ways to vet ideas. And so when lean startup and customer development came along, they seemed to resonate very strongly at a theoretical level. And the next, I'd say the last 2 years, I've spent a lot of time just taking a lot of those principles and really testing and refining them. And I'll get into some of that refinement here later. But I'd like to take a step back and really talk about why is building products hard? Why are startups hard in general? The first problem that I see is this myth that we have of the visionary entrepreneurs. And the classic, Facebook just went IPO. A lot of people are saying Mark Zuckerberg is a visionary. But what we failed to realize is that even when he started this company, which is the quote down below, he didn't build it because he was trying to be a visionary. He was just building something because he thought it was awesome or cool. And so as entrepreneurs, oftentimes when we look at our startups, we don't actually look at the business we're trying to build, or we don't look at the customers or the channels. We fall in love with the solution, and that is the awesome part. That's what gets us most excited. And this title of visionary is actually placed upon us in retrospect. So when did Zuckerberg actually become a visionary? Was it when he started the company? When he did, actually, people thought nothing of Facebook. And only over time do we appoint them that title. And so that's really an arbitrary title that often is appointed by the media and people watching on the sidelines. But the people actually doing the work, there's a lot of work and effort and a lot of questioning that goes along the way. And so even Zuckerberg very recently came out and said that even while he was building Facebook, he never really thought it was a real company. Even after he had raised all this money and had been in a lot of the colleges and universities with huge traction, he even at that point thought that Facebook was just a toy project that he was doing that was, in the eyes of investors, building confidence so that he could quit Facebook one day and build his real company. So that's the kind of stuff that we deal with. So as entrepreneurs, we are really not looking at the final picture. Most of the times, we're really looking at that short-term solution that we're building, which can be pretty myopic. And I'll touch on this a little bit. But I see that as a problem for entrepreneurs because they tend to only focus on the solution. And from the media standpoint, when we look at entrepreneurs, we only look at the successful outcomes, and we hate and we fail to see the process in between. So the other reason that I think that startups are hard is because product development actually gets in the way of learning. And this is best illustrated by this picture. So this is your typical product development cycle. It starts with requirements, some development, some testing, quality assurance, and then you finally release the product out into the world. And so while you're gathering requirements, you are doing some learning. You're going and you're figuring out what it is you need to build. But the real learning only happens when you release this product out. And in this middle, while we're building and testing and refining the product, we're not really learning much about the customers or markets. Yes, we are making the product better, but better by whose standards? And that is often where we go astray. So we spend a lot of time in this middle where we go away for several weeks at best, but oftentimes it's months or even years where we are building and perfecting this product, only to find out when we put it in front of customers that what we thought we were building is not actually what we've actually built, or what the customers thought we were building is not what we've actually built, and we actually have no product at the end, and that's when the real learning begins. And so this is a challenge, and the way you solve it is by shortening that development cycle, shortening that quality assurance cycle, and injecting customer feedback throughout the product development cycle. And that, in many ways, is what fundamentally customer development is about. And it's a parallel track for product development. So while you're building your products, you're also developing and building customers alongside that. And then the final challenge that I've encountered many times is, even when I was building my previous products, I would often hear this, is you have to go and engage customers. You have to go and learn and listen to customers. But the real challenge for me all those years had been, what do I say to them and how do I listen to them? And oftentimes when people hear this, especially the technical folks, they actually oftentimes cite this quote from Henry Ford, is that the customers can't tell me how to build the product because they aren't as visionary as I am. And they look at the Henry Ford quote and said, if Henry Ford had gone out, all he would have got from customers is go build me a faster horse. But we actually missed the gem in this scenario as well, is that it's not really our customers' job to go and tell us what they want. That's really our jobs as entrepreneurs. And that is best summed by Steve Jobs' quote. And so even in the Henry Ford quote example, what customers are really at is articulating their problems. So even in there, they weren't saying go and build an automobile because they didn't quite know what the automobile was, but they were saying that they were unhappy with their existing solution, which was the problem, and that happened to be a horse. So they were asking for something faster than a horse. And someone like Henry Ford looked at the automobile invention and said, well, that could actually replace horses, and I'm going to find a way to make that cost effectively and mass market it. And that was his big innovation, and that's why he was the entrepreneur and the customers were the customers. So this is a key point, is that we all of this stuff is not about going to customers and getting a list of what it is that they want, but rather going to customers and the deep understanding of customers and their problems lead us to uncovering the right solutions that will address those needs and help us build the businesses that we want to build. So a little bit just about myself. I mentioned I'm an entrepreneur. I started my last company with just a spark of an idea, but before I knew it, several years had passed, and I had been building products many different ways. Tried a lot of different methodologies. For those who are familiar with things like release early, release often, the 37 Signals manifesto of less is more. I even build products with a lot of features, so I was practicing more is more. Just throw out a whole bunch of stuff and see what happens. And along the way, I came to this realization is that ideas are actually very cheap, and I was getting hit by ideas all the time, and I would start acting on them, but several months and years would go by before I would learn that these things were not anywhere. And so for me, this was my new mantra, is I wanted to find the faster way to actually vet these ideas as quickly as possible. And so again, going back to what I started talking about early on, that's when I went to lean startup customer development and began putting that stuff to practice. And so some of the disclaimers that I like to put out there is I'm very much of a practice trumps theory kind of person. So even though a lot of the ideas in lean and in customer development resonated at that theoretical level, I felt it necessary to go and actually test them, because as I started to apply them, I actually had more questions than answers. And so it's only by adapting them to my own environment and actually testing them and throwing away things that didn't matter, or actually prioritizing things that mattered to others, were really how I went about it. And that is another key point, is that in all of this stuff, there are no silver bullets. You can't just take some magical tactic like split testing or continuous and call yourself lean. You really have to separate principles from tactics. So all those things like deployment, split testing, even customer interviews, in a way, they're all tactics. They're good tactics, but they don't work in every scenario. Now, there are some core principles that from which those tactics are derived, and so it's important to understand the principles and then come up with the right tactics for your own specific product, for your own specific environment. And so that's what I'm going to talk about here a little bit. So the principles that I kind of summarize in the book also are these three, and I'll kind of walk through each one in turn. So the first one is documenting your plan A. that the key challenge for entrepreneurs is going from that initial idea to one that works before running out of resources. And you can't do that unless you actually draw a line in the sand. And the reason that is important is because of this right here, is that as entrepreneurs, we are especially good at rationalizing anything. And so if we just wait to see what happens, if we just say we're just going to build this product, and if it takes off, that's great. Otherwise, we'll figure out what to do then. You can the success or failure after the fact. And that's a very scientific or a very empirical way to go about this process. And for those that might mean, you've probably already seen terms like experiments and hypotheses, and I'll touch on those a little bit here. And that is intentional because a lot of even the original lean comes from lean thinking, which is a very empirical process to manufacturing and to building products. And we apply that same rigor of thinking to actually building startups in general. And so with that mindset, if you were a scientist trying to run an experiment, you wouldn't go run this experiment and see what happens. You would have a theory, and you would distill that theory down into an expected outcome, and then you measure against that outcome and then refine the theory from there. And that's precisely what we do with our startups. This is just one big experiment. And so I'm going to now touch a little bit on the business model versus business plan. I understand you've seen Alex Osterwalder has been there and has showed you the canvas. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the benefits of the canvas over the business plan. I'll just come out and say that the business plan is one of those things that is, in the lean sense, it's a form of waste because it's often a document that investors make you go write, but they themselves don't read. So while it's an exercise for the entrepreneur, it actually goes overboard because it makes you create a lot of fictional things which are impossible to know the stage you're in because they make you think out 3-5 years from now. And all those projections are really exercised in Excel magic more than they are in how you're really going to build your business over time. So for those reasons, they end up being too big of a document. They end up being quite wasteful. And so I subscribe more to the business model canvas type of an approach, which is really your core business hypotheses, your core business model hypotheses on a single diagram. And I have come up with a slightly different variation from the business model canvas, and I call it the lean canvas. And these are some of the major elements. Since you've seen this model canvas, I thought it better just to highlight the differences in this talk. So I have a pretty long post on my blog, which is Maurya.com, where I actually detail talking about each of these changes. But here I'll just kind of outline some of the motivations for creating this. So I did start out with the business model canvas, and I was building multiple products. And one of the things that I found is that the business model canvas was very good at retrospectively looking back, be able to explain what happened. So I could look at a company like Apple and said, this is what their business model looks like. But it was not very good at telling me how Apple really got started, like what were the key problems and solutions they were really trying to address at that stage, and how did that evolve over time. And so I wanted something a lot more practical that aligned with the startup type thinking. So starting with with core things like what is the problems I'm trying to solve, who are the customers, what are the solutions I can build to address them, and then go and test them. Customer development process. So go and do problem interviews, go and do solution interviews, and then define your MVP, which is captured in the solution box, and then refine the canvas. So it's more of a working evolution of the idea versus a finished business model. So that's why I these changes because I found other things like customer relationships and key resources, particularly, to be a little too vague. It was very hard to understand what they really were communicating because those things don't change that often. If I'm building a SaaS business, I want to build a self-serve model. That will be my customer relationship, and that changes all the products that I build, and even over time, it would just be a static thing. And to me, that was that was wasteful because we have so little space on this canvas. I wanted things that would be changing more often than things that just stayed static. Other added in here were key metrics because I find that the engine of growth hypothesis, if you've read Eric's book, is very critical in understanding the scalability of your business model and how you're going to achieve growth both in the short term and long term. So I needed to find that on the canvas. And then other things that I removed were key partners. And that, I will say, was one of the more controversial things that I took out. And it was not an easy decision, but it felt, again, in the early days, I challenged a lot of startups to basically really come out and say that they're going to build a business entirely on partnerships. Now, if you're trying to do something of massive scale, so you're trying to build a solar farm in Africa, then by all means, you need to have the right partners in place to actually even start the project. You'd have to have the government on your side. You'd have to have probably big manufacturers and suppliers on your side. But most of us aren't building those kinds of businesses. So key partners don't really matter till much later in the process. Right now, no one, even your customers won't listen to you, much less your partners. And so for me, that was one that, even though it's important, it could be deferred to later. And it could actually be surfaced from other parts of the canvas. So if you really look at what partners are providing, a partner might provide you a channel, a distribution channel. Well, you could actually list that in the channel box right here. A partner could provide you a more efficient way to monetize, or it could basically optimize your cost structure. And so that could be captured in the cost structure box. So typically, if you look at every partner, they're providing some kind of a benefit to you, which is already captured in the canvas. I didn't feel like having an explicit box was necessary. So hopefully that highlights some of the differences. There's actually kind of a longer post on this. But the key message in all of this, whether you use the business model canvas or you use this one, is that the solution that we think we're building is not really the product of the startup. It's really the entire business model. The entire working business model is really what we should be empowered to think that we're building. And for me, this was a radical epiphany. So in the past, I think that all I could do was build a great product and then figure out the business model after that. And I would use the business model to not only build a business, but to attract investors. But those were things I could wait until I built this great product. And that is backwards, because in many startups, I find that these other elements are really more risky. They're more critical these days than the actual product. And that if you are an entrepreneur, you're trying to get excited about, you're actually naturally good at doing. So that's not really the risky part, which comes down to the second principle here that I'll talk about. But if you look at this picture, is showing, because the canvas is such a light for brainstorming your business model, I actually encourage you to come up with multiple variations of it. So when we first start, I have an inkling of problem, solution, and customer segment, but with just slight, we can actually change the customer segment and the entire business model changes. So I might have a file sharing product, and I might target it at enterprises, and I might charge thousands of dollars for it. There are different channels. It's probably a direct sales model. I can take that same technology, that same solution, and target it at freelancers, and all of a sudden I have a SaaS product which is maybe 1/10 the cost, and my distribution channels are more self-serve. And so the entire business model changes when you make those little tweaks. And so it's worthwhile to actually lay those variations side by side. And based on your own vision, your own goals, your own constraints, limitations, you might choose to eliminate some of them outright. So this is usually in the workshops that I teach. This is an exercise we go through, is we create multiple, we actually idealize business model, and then we go through variations of it to create these variants, and then prioritize which ones would make sense for the entrepreneur that we're talking with. The next I'd like to talk about is one of identifying the riskiest parts of the plan. Now, if you step back and actually look at these three principles, you will actually notice a pattern here. And this was a moment. So once I shifted the mindset from from going versus the product that I'm building as the true product, it was very empowering because I could actually apply the same techniques that I used to building my products to building my business model. And so the first thing that we do when we have a very complex problem is we break it up into small, there's a divide and conquer type of technique or principle. And that in many ways is what the lean canvas allows you to do. So it takes a complex problem of building a startup and it breaks it down into these 9 building blocks, which are very much connected to each other, but at the same point, they're quite separate and can be tested independently of each other. And so that is divide and conquer at its best. It's breaking that big problem into those nine smaller problems to go tackle. The next thing that we do when we face a complex problem is once we've broken it down, we don't start with the easiest stuff because we know that stuff we can always come back and do. We start with what is riskiest, and that's what the second principle is about. It's not starting with easy, but starting with what is hardest, or what is most risky about your plan. So looking at the canvas, you can actually figure out maybe the solution if you're building a web-based product is not really that challenging because it's a matter of cobbling up a bunch of SaaS services or a bunch of open source packages. But really figuring out the value proposition or figuring out the pricing might be more complex or more difficult, and that's probably where you should get started. Identified what's risky, you then go down and systematically mitigate that risk, which brings kind of this principle, and that is building a successful product is essentially about risk mitigation. And so I'm going to show you just 2 different views. So I showed you what the entrepreneur sees when they look at the canvas. They fall in love with the solution. Here, an investor does not care about the solution. They care about other things. One of the things they care most about is traction, which is represented by your key metric box. And traction is essentially another way of saying what is your engagement with your customer base? How many people are actually adopting your product right now? And if you've got good traction and you're talking to the right investor, you can almost always be guaranteed that they're going to pay attention. And then they go into secondary questions, which is, well, how are you going to make money out of this traction? Like, is the traction enough? If it's an ad-based business, is the traction to where you can command some kind of premium for that attention? If it is that traction given your margins to a scalable business model here? So those are the things they're most interested in. They aren't really interested in who the customer is, but they are definitely interested in how many of them they are. So how big is this market? And things like defensibility. So how are you going to prevent copycats from entering this market? If you get, and Facebook is an example of that, the 37 Signal guys are an example of that. Every product that comes out, PayPal, Groupon, in the beginning cares about them, but the moment they start getting any level of success, a whole bunch of copycats enter the market and try to race to push people out of that market. So how are you going to defend against such fast followers or such copycats? That's usually what the investors want to do. The message here is that they care about customer traction above everything else. And so if you look at what customers really care about, the things that matter to them, I would say the first thing that matters to them is the unique value proposition, which in many ways is the promise or the benefit of your product. And usually the way you arrive is by figuring out what problems they have, what solutions you can offer to those problems, and the intersection of those two is what that value proposition is. So if you get a value proposition, you get their attention. And if you can focus that message at them, that's what the identity box is about. So if you can identify early adopters versus the mainstream market and really focus your at the early adopters, then you can establish sort of a beachhead. It may not be your overall market size that you're going after, but you're getting that early validation with a small set or subset of users. And that's what that identity and benefit represent. And then finally, to really give you is if you have a price that is commensurate with the value you're going to provide. So if you have a value proposition and you want to get a form of currency, and it may not be monetary, it may not be money exchange, but it might be, so it might be them using your service to monetize some other way, but the fact that your service is them giving you that currency, and so you want to figure out if it's a fair exchange. So if you get these 3 things right, that customers to engage with your product, and that's just a different way of looking at the canvas. So the reason I'm kind of showing you these different views is that as just look at the solution and how the solution perfect, But when we communicate to investors, we have to look at it not solution, but in terms of things like traction, margins, size of market, unfair advantages. And when we talk to customers as well, they don't care about the solution. They really care about problems and value propositions, talking to them. And then they care about things like, is the price right for this particular service? So I'll just list out three types of risks. There's usually product, customer risk, and market risk. And the first is getting the product right. And so if you just go down these stages, the first stage was finding a problem worth solving. The second one is testing whether you've built something people want. And then finally, how do you actually accelerate growth of this product once you've got it working at even a small scale? And you can actually look at this in two different windows. The first is really before product market fit. And that middle slide should actually read product market fit. There's a typo there. So you have problem solution fit, product market fit, and then scale. And before product market fit, most of the focus by the startup is really on learning versus growth. And it's really on qualitative type of experiments, because you don't quite yet have enough customers to really run a lot of quantitative experiments. You can start gathering data, but still you have to do more qualitative learning than quantitative. Now, once you've acquired enough customers, that's when the focus can shift towards scaling, and you run experiments which are more optimization. So at this stage, you've got something that is starting to work, and you're just looking to accelerate that. So you run more quantitative experiments, you run more optimization type of experiments. And I'll have a visual here that will help you see this more visually, just coming up. And so if we kind of walk down this path, this would be kind of how the process unfolds. So the first step was coming up with your lean canvas at a brainstorming level, being able to narrow it down to maybe just 3 of them that you want to pursue. You then identify what's risky on your plan, and that may vary depending on what kind of products you're trying to build. But once you identify that, you then go into this final stage, which is now systematically testing that plan. And so if you're familiar with lean startups, you have no doubt seen this picture, which is Eric Ries's build, measure, learn loop. And so I'm just going to define an experiment using this. So one cycle around this loop, when you go from the idea to the building a product, measuring and learning, one cycle around this is an experiment. And we just know off the top that speed around this loop or the size of the loop is very critical, because we want to be able to maximize learning per unit time, which is how we're going to get to something to work before running out of those resources. So speed around the loop is very critical. At the end of every one of these experiment loops, we have to learn. And this learning is specifically targeted at learning from customers. It's not learning about how we build better products, how many features we build, or whether we execute our plan. But it's more, what did we actually learn in terms of what customers did with the product that we actually build. And product in this context is not just the actual product that you build, but it could be a stand-in, it could be a screenshot, it could be a proxy of the solution. So it could be a screenshot, a video, even a verbal interview is a form of a product that you put in front of customers. And then finally, it's important to focus on the right types of learning and the right types of experiments to run. And this is one thing that I spend a lot of time talking about, and it sometimes gets missed, and people run a lot of experiments, but they're often running the wrong kinds of experiments based on what stage they're in. And so I'll illustrate that with this diagram. So when I look at experiments, I look at it from the lens of speed, learning, and focus. And you have to have all 3 of them to be able to create an optimal learning experiment. And so to illustrate that, let's just look at what happens when you only have 2 of them. So imagine that you're running experiments and you're going very fast and you're super focused, but you're not learning anything. You're not learning anything about customers. You're just executing like crazy. The image of a dog chasing its tail comes to mind. So you're super focused, you're going fast, but you might just be running around in a circle because you don't quite know if you're getting any closer to finding product market fit or not. In another scenario, if you're actually learning, you're super focused, but you aren't going fast enough, that's where one of 2 things could happen. You could just run out of resources because your funding runs out or your runway runs out, or you could have a competitor just enter the market, see that you're actually doing some great work, and they just start copying you. And because they're faster, they out-execute you and get to market first in the minds of customers, and they take you out of the picture. So that could be a real outcome which you want to avoid. So speed is important in that scenario. And if you're on the other extreme, if you're going super fast and you're learning, but you're focused on the wrong things, that's where the trap of premature optimization comes up. And so these are examples of these might be if you're a technical founder, you might spend a disproportionate amount of time worrying about server scalability. And before you launch, you actually go and figure out how you can scale to 500,000 users, knowing that while you were doing that, you have 0 customers, and probably when you launch for the first few months, you're probably going to have a handful of customers, if any. But so that is a form of waste because you're spending all this time building and optimizing your code or optimizing your servers to be able to handle load that you don't even have and probably will not have for a while. On the marketing side, you might be doing things like landing page optimizations, which you can run forever. You can actually keep tweaking and tweaking and tweaking, but at some point there's a point of diminishing returns. If you're only going to get 100 people visit your website on a particular day after you launch, whether you have a 20% conversion or a 30% conversion, those numbers don't really matter all that much. We're talking about 2 versus 3 people hitting your site, or if it was a 2% versus 3%, but 20 versus 30 people hitting your site. Now, those numbers matter a lot when you have 1 million visits to your site, but that, again, is a much later optimization step that makes sense to go through at that time. So, again, it's important to look at this from the lens of all 3 things and find the optimal learning experiment based on maximizing for speed, maximizing for learning, and then focusing on the right types of experiments to run. And so just to bring all of this thing together, I'm just going to walk through how this kind of really unfolds. So when you start with an idea, you basically break it down into these different variants. You eliminate some off the bat. With the others, you might go and run, with the others, you actually identify what's risky with those particular models. And then you start running these experiments. And I break those down into 4 stages. So the first one is really running problem interviews, so going and interviewing customers or observing customers to understand who the customers are, what the problems really are. And just by way of doing that, you might outright eliminate some of these models. And so I usually keep multiple models, and I talk about this principle of casting a wide net in the beginning. And this is to avoid another trap, and that is one. It's a kind of a premature optimization trap, which we call the local maxima problem. And so if you just focus on one particular business model and you go really narrow and say, I'm just going to build a file sharing service for graphic designers, you might actually miss out a bigger opportunity. Maybe there's an opportunity to build a file sharing service for the medical professionals, doctors, or maybe something for lawyers or architects that may be easier for you to reach and may actually be more profitable and maybe the right fit for who you are. But you fail to see that because you prematurely picked a particular model. So in the beginning, when I tell entrepreneurs when they're brainstorming, is to in some ways, bring their own constraints into the picture, but keep an open mind to where the customer segments might lead you. And so go run these interviews and then weigh them across each other. So the first experiments you run are kind of understanding problems and customers. As a result of that, you might eliminate 1 or 2 of these models. You then start defining the solution. And defining the solution doesn't mean actually building the solution. It means coming up with a way to demonstrate the solution. So using a demo. This could be a screenshot. It could be a teaser page. It could be a landing page. But whatever it is that you build, sketches, mockups, this is where you put it in front of customers, and then you measure 2 things. You basically measure that this solution has the potential of solving the problems. So it's almost a usability test with the customers. And then you can also test things like pricing at this stage. So I recently built many products where I've gone in and sold the product just using Photoshop, Illustrator mockups, and then only after getting several strong commitments, and by strong commitments I mean actual checks from people, do I then go back and then build the product out for them. So that is a technique to, again, find a problem worth solving before committing yourself to build that product, which may be the wrong product unless you do those. Now, once you've actually built something, even at this stage, you might eliminate some of these canvases as you go along. Now, the important message here is that at some point you have to get really narrow. So you can see that this starts out with a number of possibilities, but as we go through these experiment iterations, the focus is getting more refined, and we are narrowing down to a single canvas that we then take to product market fit. And so once you've identified what that MVP is or what that customer is, the problem is, and the solution are, you build the first release of it and you test it at small scale. That's what Validate Qualitatively is about. And once you can get over that, you then look at how you're going to scale this to the entire customer segment that you're addressing, and that's the final stage of this process. And so this kind of visually shows you the process of going from that broad scope all the way down to finding product market fit for your particular product. And this is not the end, but I find this to be the first milestone that entrepreneurs need to overcome. Once they can get product market fit, some level of success is guaranteed, and there are yet more experiments to run. But at that point, it's not about finding a business model that works, but more about scaling that business model. So at this stage, I think this might be a good point to stop and take questions from the audience. If there's more time, I'll come back to a case study which is also in the book. So many of you know that I wrote a book, and I often use that as a way to illustrate the principles. But this time, the switch. I've been doing a lot of the talking.
Okay. So, questions. Who's first? You.
Hi Ash, my name is Angad. I'm a computer science student at Stanford. I have a question, which is, do you think the lean startup movement could potentially be a fad or a buzzword that people just jump onto?
Sure. So I mean, it's definitely a possibility. And if you look at a lot of these things, so before lean startup, there was in the software world there was agile. Before that, there was various variants that have come: extreme programming, waterfall, Scrum. All of these things come and go. Now, I personally don't believe it's a fad, but if you look at the hype curve, every one of these things goes through a cycle, and so it starts out with a small number of people talking about these principles. And at some point, there's a hype curve. And I think, unfortunately, right now, we're at the peak of that hype curve where the lean startup movement has been so efficient. And Eric has done a great job of traveling the world and writing a best-selling book where a lot of people want to be lean and are calling themselves lean when they're not truly practicing lean. So one of the things that I often challenge people in rooms like this is that, it's not really about people like Eric or me coming and telling people what lean is. There's so much work ahead of us. We have just really scratched the tip of the iceberg. And a lot of these things are principles, but the tactics of how to apply them there's really a lot of uncharted territories, a lot of unknowns here. And that's really where the hard work lies. And so it definitely has the danger of people just looking at lean as a fad and it not going anywhere. But there are definitely people like Eric and myself that are committed to trying to make it not go down that path.
I have a question about tactics. So at some point in your blog, you mentioned that in your new edition of your book, the one coming out in the really published by Really, you have tactics for getting people to say yes to your customer interviews, right? So are you willing to disclose that here today, or would you rather not do it?
Sure. So I will say that, so especially when you're doing interviews, and so there's a core principle in lean, which is we don't want to go measure what customers tell us. We want to go and measure what they actually do. And that was something I also learned the hard way. So before, when I would do these interviews, I would get a lot of customers to just get super excited. They would agree with me. They would say, yes, if you build this product, we'll buy it. We'll use it in 6 weeks when we're ready. And 6 weeks would come. I would go and diligently build this product. And I would try to contact them, and they wouldn't be there. They wouldn't respond to my emails. They wouldn't respond to my calls. Few of them would sign up, but then they wouldn't be. I would have to be always after them. They were not motivated. They were not my true early adopters. And so some of the tactics that I built, and there is a longer presentation that I did just on this. It was a user cycle case study where I used elements of how to rate. So oftentimes we hear things like lower sign up friction. And it makes a lot of sense, and that too is an optimization exercise. So once you have built a product, you want to make it as easy as possible for customers to use your product. That makes common sense. And so in an interview, you basically want to make it very easy for them to try your product. I find with early adopters, that's completely backwards. The early adopters are as motivated, or should be as motivated as you are, where they fight to become customers of yours. And so those are some of the tactics that I've used. So in one of my products, User Cycle, I actually raise sign-up friction. So one of the things we do in the interviews is we show them, we talk about the pain, and it resonates with them because we've done a lot of these interviews. We talk about, and that is the attention. We get their attention. Then there's an interest part of it where we show them a demo, and we don't just show them screenshots. We actually show them how our demo specifically solves these sets of problems. And so we get them super excited. They're super interested in becoming customers of ours. And so they usually ask us, well, when are you going to launch? Can we become beta customers? And that's where we kind of pull back and we say, well, in the first place, we're not looking for beta customers or beta users. We're looking for paying customers. So I believe in charging from day one. And I begin to outline the process that we are following, which is we want to find paying customers day one that have these pains, and we are going to select them very carefully. So we start asking them questions. For this particular product, it's an analytics-based product. So we ask them to share with us their current metrics, their current business model. And so we ask of them questions. So we're not lowering the sign-up friction, we're actually raising the sign-up friction. And counterintuitively, we find that that actually creates more desire than it scares away these people. Because the ones with whom the problem resonates and with whom the demo resonates, they actually want this even more because you're saying you can't have it. So it's really a marketing tactic of scarcity as well as pricing, where you're changing. And I talk about this a little bit in the book as well. But that's one of the tactics that we have used quite effectively. Is actually lower, like raise the sign-up friction, so we're not taking everyone. The other thing that we find to be very compelling is one of price anchoring. And so here I look at Steve Jobs. So before I would look at price anchoring as something I would never bring up. So I would say, I know you guys use a competitive product and you pay this much, but I would never really compare my product to a competitor's product. But when I looked at Steve Jobs introducing the iPad product, he did that very, very effectively. He actually was using the netbook as a price anchor, which was $1,000, and the iPad was only $500 in comparison. And he very effectively got people in the room to get super excited that they were getting a great deal, buying a very expensive tablet. Had he anchored against the iPhone and said, the iPad is just a better iPhone, but it's also twice as much, it wouldn't have been as effective. So oftentimes in my conversations, I bring in price anchoring. So when I tell people I'm going to charge $200 a month for this product, and I see them tense up, I ask them, well, could you actually, based on the demo you've seen, I know you guys are building your own homegrown system. Could you actually build this for 4 developer hours a month, which is what $200 a month typically translates to? And when I put it that way, they completely flip around because they know that they're spending more like 20 hours a month building the same thing. And so when you put it that way, it actually sounds like a great deal. It's a finished product. It's a polished product. It's not something they could ever build. And that also gets them over the hump. So those are some of the tactics. So there's anchoring, there's scarcity, many of these are marketing things, but they actually work quite effectively in the interviews.
So this is when they're already talking to you. But my question was more, what do you do to get them to talk to you? So, for example, this is just one example that it's us. So we have a very optimized phrase to talk to people on the phone. And they say yes, they want to continue talking to us. And this works very well in Germany, but when we try it in the US, it doesn't really work at all. So we have to start from scratch. So this is why I ask you this question, because maybe you have some pointers about how to get people to say yes to the customer development interview on the phone.
Okay, yeah. So I misunderstood yes. I was looking at yes as yes to the product. But even then, so in the early stages, what I tell people is that your challenge is to find a handful of people that you can acquire. In order to be able to interview them. So some of the most common places to start are with your 1 Degree network, with things like LinkedIn and warm referrals, and those are the normal places where I start. Now, at some point, you have to start testing your scalable channel of reaching those customers, because if you're trying to reach, say, thousands of people, and you're not using direct sales, that model is not going to work at scale. So I oftentimes inject people. I encourage people to start testing the more scalable channels. Now here too, when you start interviewing the 5 or 10 of those people that you can reach even the hard way through an outbound channel, what you're really trying to do is really nail, like in the beginning, you're trying to narrow down that customer segment. So you want to figure out who the early adopter is that has the pain the most. And you also want to narrow down to what is that pain? What is the number one pain that you can articulate that will get somebody's attention? So what I even said early on kind of fits in here, that once you can articulate a pain, if I go to a nightclub vendor and I ask them, we have a way of filling your nightclub every single night of the week, and I leave them a cold call message, and I don't even get to talk to the right person, but I leave them a voicemail and tell them how they can get in touch with me, chances are they'll call me back, because they're going to be so curious to find out what this thing is that they want to know how can I do that, right? So if it's only 15 minutes of their time, why wouldn't they take that call? So there, the tactic that I throw out there is, once you can nail the customer problem, once you can nail the customer and the number one problem, then you can almost use any kind of way to get it in front of people and get their attention. So we have used teaser pages, landing pages to get people to give us their email address, which we turn into phone calls. We know some people, we have done it ourselves. We have used LinkedIn. LinkedIn has an in-mail feature, so you can target people just by their titles, and it's not through a referral. It's just a cold email in many ways. But people take it because they can read the message, and if you are nailing a problem that they have, and you make it clear that you understand who they are and what their problems are, they almost will take a call from you. Now I'll just maybe throw out just a few other tactics. So there are other things, like if you can provide value to them. So some people go under the guise of interviewing. Like some people say, I want to interview you as a company, but in exchange I'm going to do a video or I'm going to do a blog post for you. So you're giving them free press. Those are like other ways that you can get people to talk to you. So using interviews as a guise, always playing the student card, saying you're a student at a university and you're just doing research. That's a way of getting people to talk to you. But to me, those are more disguises to get to do learning. But if you're trying to really create customers, I would say try to nail their problem. And if you really get it, if you really nail it, you're going to get them to want to hear more.
Okay, more questions?
Hi Ash, I'm Amber. I've got a question about conducting qualitative and the quantitative research at the end. Are there any good methods or tool sets that you've used to kind of collate and get a cohesive view of what the questions that you're getting from people and the problems that you're solving? Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe I'll rephrase the question. You can see if I got it right. So was the question if there's some tool sets I can recommend to capture the learning from the interviews? Yeah. Okay. So I would say that it's pretty hard because in the early days there's going to be a lot of qualitative learning, and so I do use some processes. But what I tend to do is before I go into any interview, and so a key distinction here is that these are not research interviews. We're not going there to gather facts, but we're actually going there to falsify hypotheses or validate or invalidate our assumptions. And so with every interview, I don't go and ask people, like, what would you pay for this product? Because I'm not trying to create some kind of a bell curve distribution and find an optimal price. Rather, I'm going to say, for my business model to work, I need to charge $100 a month. And so I'm going to make an offer to the customer and say it's going to be $100 a month to buy the service. And they can agree or not agree on the spot, and then I want to ask them why. So it's a different mindset. And so with that in mind, what I tend to do is I build a simple form, which are usually multiple choice type questions of what I learned, and there's some open-ended questions and maybe some notes that I take along the interviews. And each time I do those interviews, I just jot them down after the interview just to make sure that I don't forget. And there are techniques that we use where, because of that reality distortion field, or the fact that entrepreneurs tend to be more optimistic than not, I tend to find it useful to bring two people to the interview and have both of them take similar, basically capture the results independently at first. So have two forms that they fill out, and then compare notes afterwards to see if you actually agreed or disagreed and why you agreed or disagreed. So that's typically what I do, but I don't have anything more extensive as far as I've tried to do those things in spreadsheets, but they quickly get out of hand. So I just keep them more at the core hypothesis, like, so what is the price that I want to charge? What is the unique value proposition? And it's a binary, did that work or didn't it work? And then there are notes for why it didn't work, if it didn't work.
Okay, more questions? Maybe in the back, or I don't see questions. Okay, so yeah. That's one question.
Hi, my name is Saskia. I really like your idea or model of the optimal learning loop, but I think one thing is theory, the other thing is what do you do practically to figure this out. Could you tell us a bit more about what you understand of how to set the right focus, for example?
Sure. And maybe this might be a good, if the questions are winding down, since we have got another 15 minutes or so, how about I jump into the case study? And I think that will illustrate the process in action. And I think it helps a lot of people to get that. So let me bring that up. Typically, I like to use this case study, and it's not a complicated one. A book is something that a lot of people understand. It's a product just like anything else. And when I first started writing it, I basically follow this process to a T, so it helps to illustrate a lot of these principles at work. So it's not software or hardware, it's nothing complex, it's just writing a book. But even if no one has ever written a book before, you will appreciate that writing a book can be a time-consuming, big project. And so I'll kind of walk through this story of how I went about it. So back in October, I was writing my blog, and this was a blog that I wrote. I was writing on the side while I was building my business, and I was sharing a lot of the learnings that I was having while applying Lean Startup customer development to my own product. And along the way, I built this readership, and they were very interested in, well, not very interested. A few of them began to make suggestions that I turn these writings into a book because they thought it was valuable and could be easily turned into a book. So at first I was flattered, and I told them, while that's interesting, I'm too busy running my startup. I have no time to do this, so I'm not going to do it. And it's, thanks, but that's not my goal. And so I turned them away. But after about a dozen or so of these, I began to take it. So I was kind of curious and wanted to understand, like, if there really was something behind it. And so, in many ways, that became an accidental MVP. The book was not something that was a product that I had in my master plan. It was really something I stumbled into rather accidentally. But the way that I went to explore that is I ran a problem interview. So this would be a form of an experiment. And what I did was I called, I set up meetings with the handful. There were about 10 or 11 bloggers at that, bloggers with readers that had suggested I write this book. And so I called them up and I asked them why would they want me to write this book? And because I listed out all the alternatives. They were Steve Blank, if you know who he is, had written a book already, The 4 Steps of the Epiphany. There was a lot of content online. There were a lot of blogs online. So why write this book? So I was really trying to understand who the customer was and what was the value proposition they were really looking after. And many of them voiced the same problems that I had, which was when they started applying these principles, they had more questions than answers, and so they thought this would be a good solution to that problem. So this is how I basically established that this would be this is how I established what the value proposition would be through these customer interviews. But then I went one step further, and so I wanted to basically build out this product, but I didn't want to commit to writing the book because it wasn't yet a problem worth solving. So what I did instead is I built a teaser page, and at the time, this was a form of a demo, and it looked something like this. So it was not a pretty site. You'll notice there's actually no book cover because, so you asked me how do you prioritize the speed learning focus, and this is where I determined the riskiest part of the book was not anything but the table of contents. I mean, I could go and spend a lot of time designing the book cover. I could spend a lot of time researching the title of the book, but that was not going to guarantee that this book would be any good. So for me, the biggest risk item was spending a half an afternoon to create a table of contents outline, create this landing page, not worry about the book cover, just create a stock book cover. Even the title, you'll notice, if you know the book that I wrote, it's called Running Lean, Not Getting Lean. Even the book title was not the one I ended up using. It actually was suggested by somebody I interviewed. But I created this landing page in an afternoon. I set up these interviews, and I asked them, if I wrote this book, would you buy it? And also, you'll also notice on this page, there's no price. And that's because price was not a risky item for me either. This was going to be a business book, which in the US is typically priced between $20 and $30. And so I knew that, if this was a good book, people would pay that money. And so I would not ask them, I would not do any price testing with them. I was only interested in the table of contents. And this was a very valuable process because just through those 10 interviews, the table of contents changed drastically. People told me, well, you're addressing these things, but I think you should also address those. And so I refined the table of contents with them. And at the end of this process, I got all 10 of them to say, yes, if you wrote this book, I'd buy it. So that was a form of early validation, but it still didn't prove whether this would actually scale, whether it would actually be a problem worth solving. So I turned this into another experiment, and I went back to the landing page. By this point, I changed the title of the book because those interviews convinced me that Running Lean would be a better title. I left the table of contents, and this was in, I think, March of that year, and I aggressively said in 3 months I'll have this book ready. So I put coming this summer, and summer is a 3-month window, so I really gave myself 3 to 6 months to write this book. And I put an email and a notify me next to it. So the point of this experiment was to see if I could use my channel. So again, if you look at the canvas, the first part was trying to figure out what the value proposition would be, what the solution would look like. The second part was figuring out, can I actually get enough people to commit to this book before I actually build it? So I set up this teaser page up. I announced it on my blog. People like Eric helped to further spread it. I tweeted about it. Eric kind of retweeted it. Many other readers retweeted it. and I started collecting email addresses. But during this process, I did nothing with the book. I actually went back to running my startup, and I just sat there and collected email addresses. And by early summer, which is when I was going to have the book by, that's when I collected 1,000 email addresses. And for me, that was my criteria. When I reached 1,000 email addresses, that's when this would be a problem worth solving. Because if I was going to sell the book for $20, $30, that would represent $20,000, $30,000 for this project. And if I was going to do this part-time, at least I would break even. And so for me, that was my back of the envelope justification for writing this book. And so I was not writing the book at all during this time. So that's an example of an experiment to test the channels for the book. Now, interestingly enough, once I had got the 1,000 emails, I started to write the book, but it was much harder than I thought because a lot of the ideas had changed. And so I decided to create an MVP, which was not even the book. I created a free workshop. So I took the table of contents that were in the book, and I turned them into slides. I took every one of those big chapters, and I blew them out into slides, and they were not pretty slides. They were actually a lot of the content that I'm showing you right now, only it was in a much uglier format. They were just bullet points, no pictures. And I announced a free workshop here in Austin where I live, and I had 40 people interested. And there's a key principle there is that if you're delivering something of value and you want to charge for it, if you can't give it away even for free, it's going to be very hard to charge for it. So my first test was, let me give this free workshop and see if anyone will attend. And I broke that into different batches. So I took the first 10 people, I ran the workshop with them, and to me that was the MVP. That's how I was testing the content for the book without writing the book. After the first workshop, a number of people said this was super valuable. They actually would have paid for the workshop. So I did some price testing with them, and I started offering paid workshops. So the next workshop I did was not free. I charged money for it, and I kept doubling the price after that to see what the value was for this content, because people were willing to pay more and more money till I figured out how valuable this content really was. And to me, the price experimentation was really a way to gauge the interest for the content more than it was to really build a workshop as a product. The workshop was still an MVP that was built to basically mitigate the biggest risk for me, which was writing a good book. So in the workshops, I would use the slides. Remember the slides where the table of contents? After each workshop, based on how the flow went, I would go and I would change up the slides. And so in many ways, I was changing up the table of contents by way of the slides. And so that was an MVP for me by that definition. And I can continue this on to like how the book was finally written. At some point, when I'd run enough workshops, by this time summer had come and gone, and the people who were on the list began to get a little bit impatient, and they asked me, when is this book really coming out? Because you said it was going to be out in the summer, and now it's early fall. We don't see this book. We really want to have this book. And that's when I went to them, and I made a different offer. I created a different kind of an MVP where I went back to this page, and instead of saying coming this summer, I changed it to coming soon because summer had come and gone. But I gave them a pre-order option, and I told them that, writing this book was much harder than I thought, but I'm starting to write it now. And if you pre-order now, I would give you access to the book before it's done. So I made a deal where I would release the book much like I would release software. So every 2 weeks, I would release 2 chapters of the book, which allowed people to start using the content and start giving me feedback. And so this was a principle of using these 2-week releases to co-write the book with all of those early adopters. Now, interestingly enough, even at this stage, a number of the people said, I like the idea, but I don't like PDF. I only read printed books. I only read books on the Kindle. And to me, that was, again, an example of raising the sign-up friction. I could have easily gone and tried to service those needs, but to me, that was not what was risky. The riskiest thing from the beginning had been writing a good book. And so I told them, while I can go do that, I really don't want to add more effort to writing the book. So I'm going to do that at the end. If you guys can wait till the end, I'm going to support every possible format. But right now, it's just going to be PDF because that's the simplest, fastest way for me to get the book to you. And so sure enough, a number of people did not pre-order the book, but the ones that did were the true early adopters. And those guys really helped me make this book way better than it possibly could have been. They reviewed chapters every 2 weeks. They gave me feedback. They helped improve the flow of the book. A few of them improved the illustrations. They felt like the illustrations I had were not good enough, so they actually redrew them for me in Illustrator and sent me those files, and I used those in the book and credit them in the book. So that's an example of how you co-build a product with them, how you're also at every stage looking at what's risky and prioritizing the experiments you run. And so this is really an example of iterating in small batches and using that as a way to write the book. And then interestingly enough, by December of that year, I was 3/4 of the way done, and I got publisher interest. And this was not something I was really seeking. They had just caught wind of the fact that I was writing this book, and Lean Startup was beginning to take off, and so they wanted to carry a Lean Startup book in their title. And so they didn't contact me with, we'd like to explore writing a book with you. They pretty much had a book deal. They said, we have seen your work, we've actually seen the book, we like it, we want to publish the book if you're interested. And to me, that was a very confusing moment in the beginning, because I was like, why would these guys want a book that's a PDF that has been floating around and I've leaked many times? Why would they want it? And that's when it became very clear to me that the publishers were acting much like an investor would do, which is they were looking for me to actually de-risk this product. So when they think of writing a book, when an investor thinks of investing in a startup, they're not necessarily in love with the book or the content itself, but they're interested in the market or the customers behind it. And so the fact that I was able to sell at this point 1,000 copies of this book on my own gave them a lot of confidence that with their own marketing muscle, with their own retail channels, they could sell a lot more of this book. And so this book became a lot more interesting to them than it would have been in October of 2009 or even in March of 2010 when I had the original idea. And that's the same thing with any kind of an investor. If you can show any kind of early traction, you have de-risked the product significantly. And that's the true job of an entrepreneur, is to systematically de-risk your product over time. And that able to attract not only investors, but advisors, team members. There's a whole bunch of customers, a whole bunch of people that you attract. Unfortunately, you also attract competitors at some point, which is a... But this is illustrates this process of writing the book. And at some point, I self-published this book and went back to the publisher and actually created a published version of this book. So hopefully that will illustrate the process, but also the point that that the person asking the question raised.